Hello, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome to the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now, I'd like to introduce your host, Greg Powers from NeoSystems. Greg?
Thanks, Don, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Welcome to our continuing series of the Town Hall's Ask Me Anything sessions on cybersecurity maturity model certification and also other related cybersecurity topics. My guest today is Ryan Bonner of DEFCERT. Just a reminder to everyone that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach and education to the defense industrial base. Our focus as a managed service provider, providing managed security and IT services to organizations seeking certification, which is most of the audience today. Just as a reminder, if you have questions during the session, please send them in on the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll try to work them in when we can. So again, our guest today is Ryan Bonner, who has a very long resume, but would ask me to keep it very brief, so I will, as you requested, Ryan. Ryan is a provisional assessor. He's an original member of the accreditation body's industry standards working group, and he's active working with MSPs, NIST MEP, and DoD grant programs. So welcome, Ryan.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you joining. The great thing about CMMC is there just seems to be information coming out very consistently now, especially over the last few months. So obviously with the 2.0 release coming out recently, there's been quite a bit of information out on that. So I don't want to go too deep there, but maybe just at a high level, when you first went through it, any certain things like stick out in your mind, questions you had, concerns, or just you're like, wow, that surprised me, kind of thing on the general 2.0?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of attention that's been paid to the model, so CMMC 2.0, and there's really not any new content there. So I think it was very easy for people to talk about when it came out. What I'm a little more interested in with the recent changes is how the program is shifting. So I don't hear a lot of people talking about how the DoD is broadcasting this new flexible approach for implementations under 2.0. 1.0 was a very one-dimensional, you might even say brittle model where you're going to pass or fail. You need all of the requirements to be satisfied or, have a very short window to remediate. And so now that DoD is talking about the fact that you could still have unimplemented requirements and have up to 180 days to implement them and still receive an award, creates some really interesting dynamics between, the way that contracting officers and OSCs are going to talk with each other, how C3PAOs might even certify or assess an organization who knows they have outstanding POAM items. It's very interesting to see how the program is shifting. And I guess that's where I'm focused right now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the flexibility part of it was quite, different, right? I mean, and to me, there's going to be a lot more information now, specifically, like prime contractors are going to have to keep an eye on, right? If they have some supply, someone in their supply chain that, is partially, or had some POAMs and they got to complete the POAMs, and there's just a lot more information I think folks are going to have to gather, where before, like you said, it was just pass fail. It was, either I have folks that are, compliant or non-compliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even just creating the possibility where you could stretch implementation or remediation timelines from, assess 60 days, sorry, here's your determination, you passed or failed, and potentially expand that out to 180 days. 180 days is less time than you think, but it's probably a little more manageable if you've got multiple remediations.
Yeah. Well, let's face it, there's folks out there that had POAMs out there for a lot longer than 180 days. And we all know that. And I think the one other thing, and like I said, we won't go too deep here, but the bifurcation of the CUI, that I think is going to raise more questions than answers, don't you think?
Yeah, when we hear the way that the potential split in level 2 could function, we're talking about categories of CUI that are inherently less sensitive than others. And in those contracts, not really requiring or requesting CMMC certification or anything like that. I think that anytime you're dealing with a category that's CUI specified, it's far, far less likely that you're going to go into that other category where self-attestation is still going to be okay.
Right.
And the reason that I say that is because most of those specified categories of CUI have pretty stringent legal requirements or laws already attached to them. I mean, I don't think anybody out there is going to be able to say that ITAR information is somehow not sensitive anymore.
Right, exactly.
Its nature, you can't say that it's not sensitive, otherwise it's not ITAR anymore.
Yeah.
Same thing goes for CTI. I mean, those distribution statements are the result of a process where risk analysis is done, and it's deemed sensitive. So I think that for organizations who are dealing with the more common data types that we see in the DIB, CTI with DoD distribution statements, or export controlled with either an ITAR or an EAR statement, those aren't going to fall into that less sensitive category.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. Yeah, I think it's and it just that much, like I said, that much even more things that people are going to have to watch out for now, as far as, compared to, like you said, 1.0 was just, compliant or non-compliant. Now it's there's a little more cloud in there. So just more folks to keep an eye on. Okay, well, so again, so 2.0, that was released back in November. So already now we're starting to get some scoping guidance. So that's, good to see that the DoD, it looks like, is trying to stay on top of this. And I guess we're going to be seeing more things roll out here over the coming months. But your quick thoughts on some of the scoping guidance that have come out. And, we can kind of talk real quick about some of the additional systems as they've identified them, but just some quick thoughts on what you thought about the scoping guidance, and also within that, where folks who are thinking about doing a self-assessment, that just the scoping guidance kind of takes that, maybe a little more difficulty than we thought before.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that being able to understand scope is probably a prerequisite for you being able to successfully self-assess. So this is a core skill that needs to be established first and foremost, because otherwise you could find yourself self-assessing against assets that maybe even aren't part of the discussion. And so that's a critical first step. We talk a lot with organizations how, they sometimes ask for a gap assessment, but what they're saying with their words is that they need a scope assessment. They need to know which systems actually require this level of security. So when we dig into the scoping guidance that was released, a couple of things immediately show up. The first, I think, that we're going to see is that for organizations who have a flat view of scoping, they're going to see that the scoping guide has actually expanded scope from the original scope that we see in DFARS. So DFAR 7012 is laser focused on covered contractor information systems, the one that actually, store, process, and transmit CUI. And so that's our original scope. That's where we apply adequate security requirements in contract language. Now we get into the scoping guide, and we've got these new categories of assets emerging. And so before we had, in scope, out of scope, right? Covered system or not, right. That's kind of what we're here to talk about. Now we've got security protection assets. We've got, contractor risk managed assets. We've got specialty or specialized assets that are somehow not part of the discussion. And so what we're learning is that there's actually more assets that are going to be involved in assessment than the original scope of our contract requirements in DFAR 7012. That's a big mental shift.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, when folks originally looked at 2.0, they were thinking, oh, they've made this so much easier, right? They've taken out those additional 20 controls and, took out some of the process orientation of it, but then when you start getting the scoping guidance, you realize that the 110 controls, there's a lot to them, right? And that even though the DFARS has been out there for 5 years, the scoping guidance now on how they want you to look at your systems is probably a lot different than what people have been doing. So for those folks who thought, hey, we have a certain Sprs score that, we have been compliant, looking at that scoping guidance, they may be thinking differently now.
Yeah, I think all organizations need to revisit SPRS and how they understand this so that there can be alignment between CMMC scoping and what they were originally reporting under DFARS. Think about it like this. I see the scoping guidance as a good introduction for organizations to understanding applicability of requirements. Because now that you have multiple asset types, it prompts the question of, well, where do the requirements apply? And if I've got multiple system components or IT assets or even people or facility assets, as we see in the scoping guide, that fall into different buckets, I have to sort of hold up the CMMC practice that I'm currently looking at in my self-assessment and say, oh, does that apply to this bucket? Does that apply to this bucket? Does that apply to this bucket? And that automatically shows us that we will necessarily have to apply one requirement more than one time. So that sort of opens a can of worms that many organizations weren't really grasping when they were doing their initial basic self-assessments and submitting an SPRS score. They didn't apply a requirement to the firewall and all of these operating systems and their identity platform or this cloud asset, you name it. So they maybe didn't ask enough questions, if you will. So that's sort of an area that most organizations need to grow in. When we think about CUI assets, and Wade's already doing a great job of sort of laying this out. Yeah. At your core, you've got CUI assets. That is where you're at ground zero for applicability for our requirements. You're absolutely going to be asking and assessing questions in regards to those assets, like the bulk of the requirements land there. Then whenever a CUI asset isn't capable of self-protecting, providing its own security capabilities, you've got to reach outside of that scope and bring in security protection assets, SPAs. So these systems aren't guaranteed to handle CUI. They might be your Active Directory system. They might be a vulnerability scanning platform. They might be a SIM tool. They might be all sorts of specialized security assets. And they deliver security into kind of that inner circle where CUI assets live so that you can satisfy a requirement. So there's interactivity there. You see that in old diagrams for risk management frameworks and things like that. And then we're kind of seeing this new emergent category of risk managed assets, which is only here and in the discussion by nature of the fact that DoD has decided to make these determinations at the asset level. Kind of the more old school way to do this would be to do it at the network level. Hey, if these are sitting on the network with each other, they've all got kind of the same risk profile. I wouldn't let things with a different mission or business purpose on a network that has a different mission or business purpose. So I would create separation. That's kind of the old school hard-coded enterprise way of doing that. But the reality is that for a lot of small businesses, you've got intermingled assets. So where DoD is headed with this is they want to be able to minimize how much of the assessment is applied to these other assets based on this determination that they're risk managed. They could store CUI, they're capable of it. They're on the same network as CUI, but we choose not to use them for that purpose. That's an interesting gray area, to say the least, because as assessors come into these environments, how much confidence do you have in someone's risk management of these assets that are laterally next to CUI assets? Are you going to allow just a policy to be the container around that other category? Do you want to see other examples of risk management that show that you live out what's in those policies? That's going to require some clarity from CISOs and all the stakeholders as we move forward.
Yeah, and going back to when we talk about the security protection assets, I mean, a lot of gray area there, right? Because when you're talking about some of these systems are cloud-based systems, right? It could be, vulnerability scanning system, log management systems, even endpoint protection assets can come from the cloud, right? So I think it seems like the DoD wants to allow the assessors the ability or opportunity to question about those systems if they feel the need. So, it just seems like they've kind of put those in the, like you said, the next circle, right? We have the center circle being the CUI assets, which are more than fairly obvious usually, but it's that secondary circle, that those SPAs, which I think some folks are really going to take a look at.
Absolutely. And that really comes down to this expansion of scope and how we have to rethink things. So under the original model, which was driven by DFAR's obligations, we're focused on the CUI assets. If we go talk to contractors who, are OSCs in CMMC ecosystems, when they are assessed by DIBCAC anecdotally is really focused on those CUI assets, and they bring SPAs into the assessment conversation on an as-needed basis, just when that SPA does something that happens to satisfy a requirement. But now that we have just a chart in our scoping guidance that says applicable CMMC practices now have two destinations, right? CUI assets and SPAs. That's not very clarified, I guess you could say. We don't know exactly how individual C3PAOs intend to apply that or to determine where requirements should be assessed. So simple example, right? I've got a practice that says I need to limit unsuccessful logon attempts to systems. I totally expect those to be applied to my CUI assets. I'm going to tell you all about how my workstations and servers and maybe mobile devices, you name it, that handle CUI are actually limiting those unsuccessful logon attempts, right? I've got these policies in place, these configurations. At that point, once the assessor has collected that information, are they now going to turn their eyes towards SPAs and say, well, how are you doing that on your vulnerability scanning platform, on this, on that? Even though that SPA doesn't provide that capability for the CUI assets, the CUI assets do it for themselves, right? They limit their own logins. Are they going to now try and apply that requirement, even though it's not part of a capability that the SPA provides? That's where I think the C3PAOs are going to have to almost develop their way of determining applicability. And then if OSCs really want to control their own destiny, they need to develop their way of understanding applicability and self-assessment. So again, these are all keys unlocking the ability for you to have a self-assessment that serves you well in a third-party assessment. So if you can go to a C3PAO and say, I have a very well-defined rule set for where I apply requirements and where I assess requirements, because requirement scope and assessment scope could be different. If we can be honest, then the C3PAO is going to have a chance to review that and either agree or disagree. Yep. And now you can gain alignment and agreement with your C3PAO, and you don't pick the wrong pony, for lack of a better term. You don't pick a C3PAO who has wildly different ideas of applicability than you do.
Exactly, and I think that's really goes down to, again, when you talk about like a self-assessment, right? And people trying to figure this out on their own. And because of the way the DoD has set this up in 2.0, is the self-assessments have to be done every year. Now, if you look at some of these companies that are trying to do self-assessments, and they have employees coming in and out and trying to go through that process every year, and someone to have to sign that document every single year saying we are compliant. That's a tall order with the way the scoping guidance is showing right now. That's going to be a lot to go through each year compared to going ahead and getting that third-party assessment, right? And it's and you have a 3-year term on that one.
Yeah, and that's where I think organizations need to understand the purpose of each of these moving parts, right? So a CMMC certification, which is good for 3 years, is a source selection criteria used by contracting officers to decide if you get the award, right? That's why it was built. That's why it exists, so that security can be at the foundation of acquisition. Now, when we look at annual self-attestations in SPRS, which the DoD is saying you're going to have to start doing annually, and it's going to have to be submitted by high-level management executive. That is kind of like your annual attestation or renewal. That's perhaps more aligned with any annual security assessments you might do internally. So they serve different purposes. You don't get certified and then stop attesting or stop managing those security controls. That's what the expected annual attestation is supposed to do. But I think organizations are at a disadvantage. They weren't done any favors by the DoD. You have to go like layers deep into the language and into the requirements to understand how to even assess. I mean, you've got the DoD assessment methodology, which is what you're supposed to use to, come up with your SPRS score. And methodology references other documents. It's like, yeah, go look at these. And then, so you have to go to those documents, and then those documents are driven by guidance from ISU, the Information Security Oversight Office. And ISO says, hey, any organization assessing any organization, that includes yourself, or that includes the C3PAO, they have to use the methods and the procedures and the objectives that are written in 800-171A. Why do you think CMMC 2.0 sort of snapped into that synchronization with that document?
Yep.
That's why all of those components are represented in the CMMC assessment guide. They have to be. There's no options. So organizations doing a self-assessment, they might only be grading themselves against 110 data points. Well, there's 320 assessment objectives.
That's right.
Because that's what you use. So organizations who don't know the lay of the land, they're underperforming in their assessments, which means they're misrepresenting what they've actually done in those SPRS uploads.
Yeah, and then when you look at something like the scoping guidance comes out, it classifies new categories of assets to inventory, right? So that they're gonna have to figure that part out as well. And let's face it, more changes to come. Again, organizations who are trying to do this on their own, there's gonna be a lot to keep track of here.
Absolutely. When you look at how the scoping guidance works as a set of sort of knobs and levers that you can pull and turn that could get you different outcomes, we see that in order for something to be a risk managed asset, which means we're not going to apply CMMC practices to it, which reduces your assessment scope, correct? Yeah. Then in that case, it has to be inventoried and still represented in the SSP. So a lot of organizations aren't inventorying the totality of their environments where COI assets live. So now this is a new requirement effectively. I've got requirements in the model that talk about establishing inventories, but now I have to extend those along with my system security plan documentation requirements to systems where CMMC assets don't even apply naturally. So that's new. Organizations who don't have solid inventories at a minimum for your hardware, and probably including other things as well, they're not going to have defensive mechanisms for when the assessor samples an asset they want to talk about. If you don't have it in an inventory, you can't say, whoa, pump the brakes. That's on this list, not that list. So organizations don't understand the value of inventory as an ability to control assessment scope and to defend yourself against scope creep in an assessment.
Right, exactly. And I think that, when you're trying to look at, what is in scope, what's out of scope, right? Setting up your boundary. Now you've got the classifications of assets as well. Cost always comes into the equation there. When we're talking about what's in scope, what's out of scope, what's in the boundary and out of the boundary, what are your thoughts around some of that, and how you speak with some of your the folks who you're speaking with about how you distinguish when putting everything in scope compared to maybe we should go ahead and enclave some things out?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that determines the cost and of your overall assessment is that scope. And then the next thing you've got to ask yourself is, how much technical and organizational debt have I accumulated over the last 10 years since the DoD first started talking about this? And so if I have a wide variety of systems in different states of decay, because things aren't new and shiny out of the box forever, and they have patching needs, they have configuration needs, there's undocumented stuff off in the corner, whatever. If I am not operating my entire life cycle for technology at a CMMC level or better, I've got organizational debt to pay down because I have new processes to develop. So if I do that company-wide, it could be very costly and very disruptive. If I have a lot of technical debt, I've got a lot of old end-of-life systems or unsupported systems or all these other things. Good luck writing a baseline configuration.
Exactly.
If thing one should be actively supported and patched, then I probably can't even meet those requirements on some of these assets. And so from that perspective, technical debt is a big driver. So organizations, a lot of times you need to pick your battles early. Maybe you're going to build an isolated or smaller environment that you can meet the requirements in for CUI, but that's not always the long-term solution. I mean, you need CUI to flow through certain business processes and things like that for a lot of organizations. And so you need to win back those other parts of the business. You need to continue to harden those other enterprise assets. Ideally, you get to a point where everything is secured at that level, because now you're avoiding dual process. You're just doing things one way all the time. The real question is throughput. How many systems can you harden at once? How much technical debt can you pay down at once? So sometimes you got to lose a little ground to gain it back later.
Yep. Yeah, and again, a lot of that also has to do with business efficiency, right? Because when you do separate systems, you're going to have some inefficiencies that are going to come out, some duplicative things you're going to have to do between the two systems. So yeah, there's there's the cost of doing it, but there's also the efficiency that can be affected of your business, right?
Absolutely. Dual process is no fun.
Yeah.
Booting up an information security program for the first time. So if you can
Right.
find areas of your CMMC model that are relatively easy to do unilaterally company-wide, hey, we're going to start doing change control for everything. We are going to, secure our facilities everywhere. Things like that, it just reduces the mental workload that goes into doing things two different ways in two different contexts.
Well, hey, we've only got a few minutes left, so I did want to catch one more thing that was interesting in the scoping guidance. I thought, as far as assets go, is when it looks like the DoD kind of kicked the can down the road a little bit on the IoT devices and OT devices. So I know you had some thoughts around that as well.
Yeah, well, when we think about the controls that were used to build CMMC, they assumed a traditional enterprise TCP/IP stack, right?
Mm-hmm.
Normal, everyday technologies. They weren't really built for the shop floor or lots of other use cases. That's why the controls catalogs that were used to build CMMC have industrial control system overlays. You couldn't use it unilaterally. You had to build new enhancements and clarification. So I think the DoD is giving up a little ground here by scoping those out now so that they can come back with security enhancements for NIST 800-171 and CMMC for those kinds of technologies, just like we saw for NIST 800-172, right? Okay. I'm going to take these requirements, I'm going to expand on them, I'm going to enhance them, I'm going to make them more robust. I think we'll start to see that for IoT and OT down the road here. Maybe it comes in NIST 800-171 Rev 3, maybe it's a standalone document, we don't know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the question is, what are something come out during the rulemaking process, right? Is there going to be something in there that will then, revisit those devices? Because obviously some of those devices these days, right, they're connected to the network. Some can actually have CUI flowing right through them, right? I know you work with a lot of manufacturers with some of their CNC equipment, right? So, how do you work with them today? Do you have them separate those devices out on the network, or what typically do you recommend for those folks?
So the most effective thing you can do is to not flow CUI data through production workflows. You could use synthetic data to essentially move through those processes. So you still get a high integrity product in your finished goods, but you don't unnecessarily turn shop floor equipment into CUI assets. So this is more of a data management discussion. If you can do that, then organizations control their own destiny out on the shop floor. You almost always have to reintroduce that CUI during quality operations or other parts of the production process, but you want to know when you're going to introduce CUI, whereas a lot of organizations now just kind of de facto flow it down, and that's not the only option. So that's the best possible way of managing this. In situations where that's not feasible, it's all about building modern security around those tools that you're going to have a hard time securing. Right. I'm going to put a layer 7 firewall in front of OT, and so that I can provide something through an SPA, security, protection asset, that the CUI asset can't provide for itself. Those two almost become one system at that point.
Great. Well, hey, again, Ryan, thank you so much. Appreciate you attending today. For those out there, we will be having our next town hall series next Wednesday, same time. Our guest then will be Matt Travis, and from the CMMC AB. And the week after, we have Bob Metzger on the 19th. So again, Ryan, thank you very much. Appreciate the input today. Wade, thanks for the great work you're doing back there. And we hope to see everyone back next week on the 12th.
Thanks again.
Thank you.